Welcome to Code Your English, the home to learn and grow fast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Code Your English, a place where we don't just learn English. We understand how real growth actually works. Here, we don't chase quick results or complicated methods. We focus on simple ideas that truly change the way you learn, think, and improve, step by step, day by day. In today's episode, we're going to explore something very powerful. A truth that most people misunderstand. The idea that small actions, repeated daily, can create big change. But before we talk about results, before we talk about success, we need to understand something deeper. Why does it feel like nothing is happening at the beginning? Why does progress feel invisible, even when you are trying your best? Because real change doesn't start where you can see it. It starts quietly. At the beginning of any meaningful change, there is a phase that feels almost invisible. You put in effort, you try to stay consistent, you show up every day, but nothing seems to happen. There is no clear result, no visible improvement, no external validation. It feels quiet, almost empty. And this is exactly where most people start to doubt themselves. They begin to think, maybe this isn't working, or maybe I'm doing something wrong. But what they don't realize is that this silent phase is not a sign of failure. It is actually where real progress begins. Think of it like a seed planted in the ground. When you plant a seed, you don't expect it to become a tree overnight. For days, sometimes weeks, nothing appears above the surface. If you look at the soil, it seems like nothing is happening. But underneath, something powerful is taking place. Roots are forming. The foundation is growing. The seed is preparing itself for what will eventually become visible. In the same way, your efforts, no matter how small, are working beneath the surface, even if you cannot see the results yet. This is where many people misunderstand progress. They expect it to be immediate and visible, like a straight line going up. But in reality, progress is often delayed. It hides before it shows. It builds quietly before it reveals itself. What you see on the outside is only a small part of what is actually happening. Like an iceberg, the biggest part exists below the surface, unseen but essential. And if you judge your progress only by what you can see, you will almost always feel discouraged too early. There is also a psychological challenge in this phase. Humans are naturally wired to respond to visible rewards. When we do something and immediately see a result, we feel motivated to continue. But when there is no visible feedback, the brain starts to question the value of the effort. This creates frustration, and over time, that frustration turns into doubt. That's why so many people stop, not because they are incapable, but because they cannot see what is already happening. Understanding this changes everything. It allows you to shift your perspective from nothing is working to something is building. It helps you stay calm instead of becoming anxious. You begin to realize that the absence of visible results does not mean the absence of progress. It simply means you are still in the early stage, the invisible beginning where the most important work is being done quietly. And once you truly accept this idea, something inside you relaxes. You stop chasing quick results, and you start trusting the process. You become more patient, more consistent, and less dependent on immediate outcomes. Instead of asking, "Why am I not seeing results?" you begin to understand, this is the phase where results are being prepared. This shift may seem small, but it is powerful. because the people who succeed are not always the most talented. They are the ones who can continue even when nothing seems to be happening. They understand that progress does not always announce itself in the beginning. Sometimes it grows in silence first. The lie of big change. There is a powerful belief that quietly controls how most people approach change, and it sounds something like this. If I want big results, I need to take big actions. At first, it feels logical. It even feels motivating. People think they need to push hard, do more, go all in, and transform their lives in a short period of time. So they create intense plans, set extreme goals, and try to change everything at once. But this belief, as attractive as it sounds, is deeply flawed, and often becomes the very reason they fail. You can see this pattern everywhere. Someone decides to get fit, and suddenly they try to work out every single day for hours. Someone wants to learn a new skill, and they overload themselves with too much information at once. Someone wants to improve their life, and they attempt to change multiple habits overnight. In the beginning, there is excitement. Energy is high. Motivation feels strong. It looks like progress is about to happen quickly. But then, something shifts. The intensity becomes overwhelming. The effort becomes exhausting. And slowly, consistency begins to break. This is the hidden cost of the big action mindset. It creates a cycle of extremes. You go from doing too much to doing nothing at all. From high motivation to complete burnout. From feeling powerful to feeling disappointed in yourself. And the most dangerous part is that people often blame themselves for this failure. They think they lack discipline or willpower, when in reality, the strategy itself was unsustainable from the beginning. There is also a psychological illusion involved here. Big actions feel meaningful because they are dramatic. They give you the emotional satisfaction of doing something important. But that feeling is temporary. It does not last long enough to support real change. On the other hand, small actions feel almost insignificant. They don't create excitement. They don't give instant results. And because of that, people underestimate them. They ignore them. They choose intensity over consistency, again and again. If you compare these two approaches side by side, the difference becomes clear. Imagine someone who studies a language for 5 hours in one day and then stops for a week, versus someone who studies for 20 minutes every day without fail. The first approach feels impressive in the moment, but it lacks continuity. The second approach feels small, almost too simple, but it builds momentum over time. And in the long run, momentum always wins over intensity. This is where the discomfort begins. Because once you see this clearly, you start to question your own habits. You realize that many of your past efforts were not ineffective because you didn't try hard enough, but because you tried too hard, too fast, in the wrong way. That realization can feel uncomfortable. It challenges your old way of thinking, but at the same time, it opens the door to a better approach. When you begin to question the idea that big results require big actions, you create space for a new understanding. You start to see that success is not built in moments of extreme effort, but in patterns of repeated behavior. It's not about how intensely you act for a short time. It's about how consistently you show up over a long time. And this shift from intensity to consistency is where real and lasting change begins. The power of accumulation. Once the illusion of big actions starts to fade, a quieter but far more powerful truth begins to appear. Real change does not come from intensity, it comes from accumulation. Small actions, when repeated consistently over time, begin to stack on top of each other. At first, this stacking feels almost meaningless. One small action does not seem to change anything, but when that same action is repeated again and again, something starts to build. And that slow build is what eventually leads to transformation. A simple way to understand this is through the idea of compounding. Imagine you improve just a tiny bit every day, so small that you can barely notice it. 1% better today, another 1% tomorrow. On a single day, this feels insignificant, but when this improvement continues over weeks and months, the effect is no longer small. It multiplies. It expands. What once felt invisible becomes undeniable. This is the hidden power of accumulation. It does not grow in a straight line. It grows exponentially. Think about it like saving money with interest. If you only look at the first few days or even weeks, the growth seems almost flat. It feels like nothing is happening. But over time, the interest starts to build on itself. You are no longer just growing from your original effort. You are growing from everything you have already built. The same principle applies to your habits, your skills, and your daily actions. Each small step adds to the previous one, creating a chain of progress that becomes stronger with time. This is why repetition is so powerful. Every time you repeat a small action, you are not starting from zero. You are adding another layer, another brick, another piece to the structure you are building. And while one brick does not look impressive, hundreds of bricks create something solid and lasting. The magic is not in any single action. It is in how those actions connect and accumulate over time. What makes this idea so hopeful is that it changes the way you see effort. You no longer need to rely on motivation or wait for the perfect moment to take big action. Instead, you can focus on what is small, simple, and repeatable. You begin to trust that even the smallest effort has value because it contributes to something larger. This creates a sense of calm curiosity. You start to wonder, if I keep doing this, where will I be in a few months, in a year? And that question alone can be enough to keep you moving forward. At the same time, this understanding reshapes how you think about progress. Instead of looking for immediate results, you begin to see progress as a process of accumulation. You recognize that every small action is part of a bigger system. Even on days when it feels like nothing has changed, you know that something has been added. Something has been reinforced. And over time, those additions become the difference between staying the same and becoming something new. This is the true mechanism behind lasting change. It is not dramatic. It is not fast. But it is reliable. Repetition, combined with time, creates transformation in a way that intensity never can. And once you truly understand this, small actions no longer feel small. They start to feel powerful because you can see what they are slowly becoming. The identity shift. As small actions begin to repeat and accumulate, something deeper starts to happen. Something that goes beyond visible results or external success. At first, you may believe you are simply doing something, studying a little every day, exercising regularly, practicing a skill. It feels like a set of actions, a routine you are trying to follow. But over time, these repeated actions begin to shape something far more important than outcomes. they begin to shape who you are. This is the shift most people don't notice at first. They focus on results, how much they improved, what they achieved, what changed on the outside. But the real transformation is happening internally. Every time you repeat an action, you are sending a message to yourself. A quiet signal that says, "This is what I do. This is the kind of person I am becoming." And when that message is repeated enough times, it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like identity. Think about it in a simple way. If someone studies a language once, they don't call themselves a learner. If they study for a week, maybe they still hesitate. But if they show up every day for months, something changes in how they see themselves. They no longer say, "I am trying to learn." Instead, they begin to feel, "I am someone who learns every day." The action has moved from something external to something internal. It has become part of their identity. This is powerful because identity drives behavior far more strongly than motivation ever can. When you see something as part of who you are, you don't need to force yourself to do it. It feels natural. It feels aligned. A person who sees themselves as a reader doesn't struggle to pick up a book. A person who identifies as disciplined doesn't constantly fight their habits. Their actions follow their identity almost automatically. And here is the deeper truth. Identity is not something you are born with or something fixed. It is something you build slowly and quietly, through repetition. Every small action you take is like a vote for the type of person you want to become. One action may not feel important, but repeated actions create a pattern, and that pattern becomes your self-image. There is also an inner dialogue that begins to change during this process. At the start, your mind might say, "I can't do this consistently," or "I'm not that kind of person." But as you continue to show up, even in small ways, that voice begins to weaken. A new voice starts to emerge. "I've done this before. I can do it again." And eventually, it becomes, "This is just what I do." That shift in internal language is a clear sign that identity is forming. What makes this realization so empowering is that it gives you control in a different way. Instead of chasing big results or waiting to feel motivated, you can focus on becoming the kind of person who naturally produces those results. You stop asking, "How do I achieve this?" and start asking, "Who do I need to become?" And the answer is always built through small, repeated actions. This also explains why consistency matters more than perfection. Missing one day does not break your progress, but abandoning the pattern does. Because identity is not built on single moments, it is built on repeated evidence. The more evidence you give yourself, the stronger that identity becomes. And once it becomes strong enough, it starts to carry you forward, even on days when motivation is low. In the end, this is where the real transformation happens, not just in what you achieve, but in how you see yourself. You are no longer someone who is trying or hoping or starting again. You become someone who simply lives the behavior. And when that happens, change is no longer something you chase. It becomes something you embody. The resistance loop. By this point, the idea is clear. Small actions matter. Repetition builds results. Identity is shaped through consistency. On a logical level, it all makes sense. And yet, this is exactly where most people still struggle. Not because they don't understand, but because something inside them keeps pushing back. This is what can be called the resistance loop, a quiet but powerful cycle that interrupts progress even when the path is clear. The first layer of this resistance often shows up as boredom. When you repeat the same small action every day, it stops feeling exciting. There is no novelty, no emotional high, no sense of something new happening. In the beginning, motivation comes from excitement. But repetition removes that excitement. The action becomes predictable, almost mechanical. And the mind starts to resist it. It says things like, "This is too simple," or "This is not interesting anymore." What it really means is, "This does not stimulate me enough to continue." But this is the paradox. What feels boring is often exactly what works. Then comes the second layer, the lack of immediate reward. Human psychology is strongly wired for instant feedback. When you do something and quickly see a result, your brain releases a sense of satisfaction. It tells you, "This is working, keep going." But small, repeated actions rarely give that kind of immediate response. You might study, practice, or improve slightly, but the result is too small to feel. And because you cannot feel it, your brain begins to question it. It asks, "Why am I doing this if nothing is changing?" This creates a subtle frustration, and over time, that frustration weakens your willingness to continue. The third layer is doubt, and this is where the loop becomes even stronger. Doubt does not always come as a loud, clear thought. Sometimes it appears quietly, almost like a whisper. "What if this doesn't work?" Or, "Maybe this is not enough." Even after understanding the power of accumulation, the mind still looks for certainty. It wants proof. It wants reassurance. And when results are still invisible, that proof is missing. So doubt fills the gap. It makes you question the process, the method, and sometimes even yourself. When these three forces, boredom, lack of reward, and doubt combine, they create a repeating cycle. You start with a small action. You repeat it for a few days. Then boredom appears. The lack of visible results makes the effort feel meaningless. Doubt begins to grow. And eventually, you stop. Not because the method failed, but because the resistance became stronger than your patience. Then, after some time, motivation returns again. You start over, and the cycle repeats. What makes this loop dangerous is that it feels personal. People often interpret it as a failure of discipline or character. They think, "I am not consistent," or "I always quit." But in reality, this pattern is not unique to them. It is a natural response of the human mind. The brain is designed to conserve energy, seek pleasure, and avoid uncertainty. Repeating small actions without immediate reward goes against all three of these tendencies. So resistance is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that you are doing something that requires growth. Understanding this changes the experience completely. Instead of being surprised by resistance, you begin to expect it. When boredom appears, you recognize it as part of the process, not a reason to stop. When results feel invisible, you understand that the reward is delayed, not absent. When doubt enters your mind, you see it as a normal reaction to uncertainty, not as truth. This awareness creates distance between you and your thoughts. You no longer react automatically. You observe and then choose. There is also an internal conflict that becomes clearer once you notice this loop. One part of you wants progress, growth, and long-term change. Another part wants comfort, ease, and immediate satisfaction. These two forces are always present, and the resistance loop is simply the moment when the second one becomes louder. The key is not to eliminate this conflict, it is to understand it. Because once you see it clearly, it loses some of its control over you. In the end, the goal is not to remove resistance, but to move forward with it. The people who succeed are not the ones who never feel bored, never doubt, or always feel motivated. They are the ones who understand that these feelings are temporary and predictable. They don't see resistance as a stop sign. They see it as part of the path. And that realization is deeply validating. It removes the feeling of being alone in the struggle. It replaces self-criticism with awareness. You begin to see that the problem was never your ability. It was your interpretation of these internal signals. Once that interpretation changes, the loop starts to weaken. And in that space, consistency becomes possible again. The repetition advantage. After understanding the resistance loop, something important begins to shift. What once felt like a problem, repetition, starts to reveal itself as an advantage. But this shift does not happen automatically. Because for most people, repetition still feels dull, predictable, and even frustrating. The mind naturally prefers variety, excitement, and quick wins. So when you are asked to do the same small action again and again, it feels like you are not progressing. It feels like you are stuck. And this is exactly why repetition becomes powerful. Because most people choose to avoid it. If you look closely, the majority of people do not fail because they lack knowledge or ability. They fail because they stop too early. They try something, repeat it for a short time, and then move on when it no longer feels exciting. They keep searching for something new, something faster, something more interesting. But in doing so, they constantly reset their progress. They never stay long enough in one place for accumulation to take effect. So while they are always busy, they are rarely advancing. Now, compare this with someone who embraces repetition. This person does not chase constant change. They are willing to do the same small action every day, even when it feels ordinary. They do not depend on motivation or excitement to continue. Instead, they rely on consistency. And over time, this creates something very powerful: momentum that others never reach. This is where repetition turns into a quiet form of advantage. It is not loud or impressive in the moment. No one celebrates it. It does not look like a breakthrough. But while others are stopping, restarting, and changing direction, the person who repeats continues to move forward. Slowly, steadily, almost invisibly, but continuously. And in the long run, continuous movement always outperforms interrupted effort. There is also a subtle form of competition here, even if it is never spoken. Most people are not competing based on skill alone. They are competing based on how long they can stay consistent. And this is where repetition separates people. Not because it is difficult to understand, but because it is difficult to tolerate. Anyone can start something. Few can continue when it becomes repetitive. And that gap creates opportunity. What once felt like boredom now begins to look different. It becomes a signal that you are in the right phase, the phase where others usually quit. Instead of asking, "Why is this so repetitive?" you begin to think, "This is where most people stop. So, if I continue, I move ahead." That simple shift changes the emotional experience. Repetition is no longer something you endure. It becomes something you use. There is also a deeper realization that comes with this. Repetition is not just about doing the same thing. It is about refining it. Each time you repeat an action, you have the chance to do it slightly better, slightly more efficiently, slightly more naturally. The improvement may be small, almost unnoticeable, but it is there. And over time, these small refinements compound, just like the actions themselves. What started as effort slowly becomes skill. What felt unnatural begins to feel automatic. This is why consistency becomes a true competitive edge. Not because it is complex or advanced, but because it is rare. Most people are distracted by the search for better methods, faster strategies, or easier paths. They underestimate the power of staying with something long enough for it to work. But the ones who understand repetition do not need to search endlessly. They choose a simple path, and then they stay on it. Emotionally, this creates a sense of acceptance. You stop fighting the nature of the process. You stop needing every day to feel exciting or rewarding. You accept that progress can feel quiet, even boring at times, and that this is not a weakness of the method, but a strength of it. Because what feels boring is often stable, and what is stable is what lasts. In the end, repetition becomes more than just a method. It becomes a mindset, a way of approaching growth that values persistence over intensity and patience over quick results. And once you truly see it this way, something changes. You no longer look for shortcuts. You no longer fear doing the same thing again. Instead, you begin to understand that doing the same small action again and again is not holding you back. It is what quietly moves you forward while others fall behind. The time illusion break. There is a quiet misunderstanding that shapes how people experience progress, and it has everything to do with how they see time. Most people look at time in short fragments, days, maybe weeks, and they expect meaningful change to fit inside those small windows. When it doesn't, they feel disappointed. They begin to think nothing is working. But the real issue is not the effort they are putting in. It is the time frame they are using to judge it. In the short term, almost everything feels slow. You can put in effort for several days and barely notice a difference. Even after a few weeks, the change can still feel small, almost insignificant. This creates a powerful illusion. The illusion that your actions are not producing results. But what is actually happening is something different. The change is real. It is simply too small to be clearly visible within such a narrow window of time. At the same time, there is another side to this illusion. While people underestimate what can happen over long periods, they tend to overestimate what can be achieved quickly. They believe that a few intense days or weeks should create a big transformation. And when that expectation is not met, frustration begins. This creates a cycle of impatience. You try hard for a short time, expect big results, don't see them, and then lose trust in the process. To break this illusion, you have to step back and expand your view of time. Instead of looking at what changes in a few days, you begin to consider what can happen over months or even years. And when you do that, something interesting happens. The same small actions that felt meaningless in the short term start to look powerful in the long term. You begin to see that what feels slow is actually building something steady, and what builds steadily becomes strong. Imagine looking at your progress from the perspective of your future self. Not tomorrow, not next week, but months from now. If you continue a small habit every day, where will you be after 90 days? After a year? Suddenly, the scale changes. What once felt like a tiny effort begins to stretch across time. creating a path of growth that is much larger than you initially imagined. This shift in perspective activates a different kind of thinking, long-term thinking, where patience becomes possible. There is also a calming effect in this realization. When you stop expecting immediate transformation, you remove a lot of unnecessary pressure. You no longer need every day to prove that you are making progress. Instead, you trust that progress is happening, even if it is not yet visible. This allows you to stay consistent without feeling anxious or rushed. You become more focused on the process, less obsessed with the outcome. Another way to understand this is by comparing two timelines. On one timeline, someone works intensely for a short period, then stops, then starts again, always expecting fast results. On the other timeline, someone performs a small action consistently over a long period. At first, the first timeline looks more impressive. There is more visible effort, more bursts of activity. But over time, the second timeline quietly overtakes it. Because consistency, when extended over time, creates depth that intensity cannot match. This is where patience becomes more than just a virtue. It becomes a strategy. Not passive waiting, but active trust in the process. You are still taking action, still repeating small behaviors, but you are no longer demanding immediate results from them. You understand that time is part of the equation, not something separate from it. Repetition without time is not enough. But repetition combined with time becomes transformation. As this understanding deepens, your relationship with progress begins to change. You stop measuring your efforts by how quickly they pay off, and start measuring them by how consistently you can maintain them over time. You become less reactive, less emotional about short-term outcomes. And in that space, something powerful happens. You gain stability. In the end, breaking the time illusion is not just about thinking longer term. It is about aligning your expectations with reality. Real change takes time. Not because it is slow, but because it is building something solid. And once you truly accept this, you stop rushing the process. You begin to move with it. The quiet transformation point. After a long period of quiet effort, something begins to shift, and it often feels sudden. One day, you notice a difference. It might be small at first, but it is clear. Your skill feels sharper. Your habit feels natural. Your results finally start to show. And in that moment, it can feel like everything changed overnight. As if all the effort suddenly worked at once. But what you are witnessing is not a sudden transformation. It is a visible one. The real transformation has been happening for a long time, just beneath the surface. This is what can be called the quiet transformation point. It is the moment when all the invisible work finally becomes visible. When the accumulation of small actions crosses a certain threshold and begins to show itself in a way you can no longer ignore. And because this moment is so clear, so noticeable, it creates an illusion. It makes it seem like the change happened quickly, when in reality it was slowly building all along. You can imagine it like water slowly heating on a stove. For a long time, nothing seems to happen. The temperature rises, but there is no visible change. Then, at a certain point, the water begins to boil. If you only look at the moment it starts boiling, it feels sudden. But the boiling is not the beginning of the process. It is the result of everything that came before it. Every small increase in temperature was necessary to reach that point. The same pattern appears in real life again and again. A person practices a skill for months, with little visible improvement, and then suddenly performs with confidence. Someone works on their health quietly, and one day others begin to notice the change. A learner struggles with a language for a long time, and then suddenly starts speaking more naturally. To an outside observer, it looks like a quick breakthrough, but to the person who went through the process, it is the result of consistent, often unnoticed effort. This is where the idea of sudden success begins to break apart. What looks sudden is almost never truly sudden. It is simply the point where progress becomes visible enough to be recognized. The danger is that people often focus only on this visible moment. They admire the result, but they overlook the long period of repetition and patience that made it possible. And because they do not see that hidden phase, they expect the same kind of sudden outcome in their own journey, without realizing what it actually requires. Understanding this changes how you experience your own progress. Instead of waiting for a dramatic breakthrough, you begin to trust that you are moving toward a transformation point, even if you cannot see it yet. You recognize that every small action is contributing to something that will eventually reveal itself. This creates a sense of anticipation, not the anxious kind, but a quiet confidence. A feeling that says, if I continue, this will show. There is also something deeply motivating about this realization, because it means that your efforts are never wasted, even when they feel invisible. It means that progress is not lost. It is simply waiting to become visible. And that changes how you respond in the difficult middle phase. When nothing seems to be happening, you no longer see it as a sign to stop. You see it as a sign that you are still building toward that moment. At the same time, this understanding brings a certain level of humility and patience. You stop chasing the visible moment as if it is the only thing that matters. You begin to respect the process that leads to it. Because you know that without the quiet, repetitive work, the visible transformation would never appear. In the end, the quiet transformation point is not just a moment, it is a reveal, a confirmation that the process works, a reminder that change often happens slowly, and then all at once. And once you experience it, even in a small way, it changes your belief. You no longer need constant proof. You have seen what consistent effort can become, and that belief makes it easier to continue, long before the next transformation becomes visible. The behavioral commitment. After understanding how change really works, how it begins invisibly, builds through repetition, faces resistance, and eventually reveals itself, the next step is not to do more, but to do less, more clearly. This is where everything becomes practical. Because without a clear behavioral commitment, even the best understanding stays theoretical. And the mistake most people make at this point is going back to complexity. They feel inspired, so they try to redesign their whole life again. But real progress doesn't need complexity. It needs something simple enough to repeat. The idea here is not to focus on big goals, but on small, repeatable actions that you can actually sustain. Big goals are often distant and abstract. They create pressure. They make you think about outcomes you cannot control yet. But small actions are immediate. They are within your control. And more importantly, they are easier to repeat. When you shift your focus from "what do I want to achieve" to "what can I do today, no matter what," something becomes clearer. The path stops feeling overwhelming. This is where simplicity becomes powerful. Instead of saying, I will completely change my routine, you bring it down to something smaller and more grounded. Something that feels almost too easy. A short daily practice. A few minutes of focused effort. A single action that you can repeat even on difficult days. The goal is not to impress yourself. It is to create consistency. Because consistency is what builds everything else. There is also an important psychological shift happening here. When actions are small and clear, they reduce resistance. The mind no longer sees them as heavy or demanding. It becomes easier to start, and once you start, it becomes easier to continue. This removes the need for constant motivation. You are not waiting to feel ready. You are simply following a behavior that has already been decided. At the same time, this approach brings a sense of calm. You are no longer trying to do everything at once. You are not chasing fast results or dramatic changes. Instead, you are focusing on one simple commitment, showing up and repeating a small action. This reduces pressure and creates stability. It allows you to move forward without feeling overwhelmed. Another key part of this is reducing decision-making. When you decide in advance what your small action is, you remove the daily question of, what should I do today? That question often leads to hesitation or inconsistency. But when the action is already defined, the process becomes automatic. You don't negotiate with yourself. You simply act. This builds a rhythm, and that rhythm makes consistency easier over time. It is also important to understand that the size of the action is not what determines its value. What matters is its repeatability. A small action done every day is far more powerful than a large action done occasionally. This is why even the simplest behaviors, when repeated, can lead to meaningful change. They do not rely on energy or mood. They rely on structure. As this commitment becomes part of your routine, something interesting happens. You stop thinking about progress in terms of big milestones and start seeing it in terms of continuity. The focus shifts from how far have I come to did I show up today? And that question is much easier to answer consistently. In the end, this is what anchors everything. Not a big plan, not a burst of motivation, but a small, clear, repeatable behavior that you commit to daily. It may not feel impressive. It may not look like much from the outside. But it is enough. Because once that behavior becomes stable, everything else begins to build on top of it. And that is where real change becomes sustainable. Not through intensity, but through simplicity that you can actually maintain. At the end of all this, everything comes down to one simple but powerful shift in how you define success. Most people grow up believing that success is about intensity, about doing more, pushing harder, making big moves, and achieving fast results. It feels exciting, it looks impressive, and it creates the illusion of rapid progress. But as you've now seen, that definition is incomplete. In many cases, it is the very reason people struggle to move forward consistently. The real shift happens when you begin to redefine success, not as something dramatic, but as something steady. Not as something that depends on how much you do in a short time, but on how reliably you can show up over a long time. Success is no longer about peaks of effort. It becomes about patterns of behavior. It becomes about continuity. This changes how you measure yourself. Instead of asking, "Did I do something big today?" you begin to ask, "Did I stay consistent today?" That question is quieter, but much more powerful. because it focuses on what actually leads to progress. It removes the pressure to perform and replaces it with the responsibility to continue. There is also a deep sense of control that comes with this reframe. Intensity often depends on motivation, energy, or external circumstances, things that are not always stable. But consistency is something you can design. You can build it into your routine. You can rely on it even when you don't feel your best. This means your progress is no longer dependent on how you feel in the moment. It becomes something more stable, more predictable, and more within your control. Emotionally, this creates confidence, not the loud, temporary confidence that comes from doing something extreme, but a quiet, steady confidence that comes from knowing you can rely on yourself. When you prove to yourself day after day that you can show up and repeat a small action, you begin to trust your own behavior. And that trust is far more valuable than short bursts of motivation. There is also a philosophical shift in how you begin to see growth itself. You stop seeing it as something that happens in big moments and start seeing it as something that is built in small ones. You understand that the extraordinary is often just the result of ordinary actions repeated long enough. What once looked like talent, luck, or sudden success now looks different. It looks like consistency over time. A simple way to capture this shift is through contrast. Intensity makes you feel powerful for a moment. Consistency makes you powerful over time. Intensity depends on how you feel. Consistency depends on what you do. Intensity can start fast, but it often fades. Consistency starts small, but it lasts. And once this idea becomes clear, something settles inside you. You stop chasing extremes. You stop waiting for the perfect moment or the perfect level of motivation. You no longer feel the need to prove yourself through big actions. Instead, you focus on something much simpler and much stronger. Showing up, repeating, continuing. In the end, this is the reframe that stays with you. Success is not about how intense your effort is. It is about how consistent your behavior becomes. And when you truly accept that, you no longer feel lost or overwhelmed. You feel grounded, because now the path forward is clear. Just one small action, repeated, again and again, and that is enough.